All right, we are going to talk strictly about some architecture now, 20th century and postmodern architecture. I am narrating this presentation that was put together by Grant Smith. So he's done a wonderful job at kind of showing us the differences between these two terms of 20th century and postmodern. 20th century architecture is also just called modern architecture. That's kind of how I reference it, as modern and postmodern. And honestly, that's how I see it the most. Very rarely do I see it called 20th century architecture. And that's because postmodern architecture is also in the 20th century. All of these styles we're going to learn about are all 20th century architecture. So I feel like that's very, very confusing. Giving the terms modern versus postmodern, I think, is a little bit more clear. But basically, they're characterized by technological advances, just like anything else. Those skeleton frameworks that we learned about when we learned about the Carson Perry Scott building, that was a huge innovation, and construction in that method and the use of those materials have continued to advance. But whereas postmodern architecture is a response to this, and like many other things, a rejection of it. So we have real polar opposites between modern and postmodern, and one is a break from tradition and all about new traditions, new technologies, and the other one is a return to tradition. So you're going to get to see examples of both of that. He broke it down into some subcategories here. So for time periods, the 20th century architecture began in the early 20th century, so in the early 1900s. And this type of architecture really kind of began to take off after World War II. We had to kind of get through, post-war, get through the Depression, get through a lot of those kind of economic issues. And when we're able to, revive our society and our economy again, then this 20th century architecture really started to take off. Postmodern architecture is more mid 20th century, really kind of around the 1960s, super flourished in the 80s and the 90s. And again, this is, a reaction to that 20th century architecture. In terms of geographical locations for 20th century architecture, the two most popular locations was definitely Europe and the US. Honestly, I feel like for the architectural styles that we're going to be looking at, and really where a lot of the meccas for these architectural structures were mostly in the US. They definitely, existed in Europe as well, but I think the U.S. kind of became more of a home base during the 20th century for, a push in architecture. But remember too, Europe, Europe is the old world, and the Americas is the new world. And so, we had, first of all, a lot of catching up to do. And as populations grow, then so does your industry, and so does your need for architecture. So that's just part of it. But anyways, it was definitely adopted worldwide. But really, I feel that the U.S. kind of dominated it. And it's also the same for postmodern architecture, but it was, definitely prominent in the U.S., Europe, Japan, and Australia. But we're going to be, our images really kind of hone in on the U.S. In terms of history and some of that contextual information for 20th century architecture, it emerged because of advances in technology. And remember when we talked about that Carson Perry Scott building, that huge industrial revolution, the mass output of, steel and, large sheets of glass. That's was what was able to advance the technologies for construction, is the fact that you had these materials now. And not only did you have these materials, but you could have them in mass quantities. That's what's important. Factories and industry were able to output these things easily and quickly. And so, you were able to develop skyscrapers and things like that because you had readily available materials. So really, this was kind of dictated off of the materials. And then when you have this massive output of materials, not only does the innovation of construction grow, but then your style kind of has to grow with it. It has to kind of match what these capabilities are and these possibilities, okay? Where postmodern architecture began in the 60s, but like I said, really flourished in the 80s and the 90s. And architect Venturi was one of the central figures who kind of formed this postmodern movement. And he definitely was first part of that modern movement. He had developed many buildings in this 20th century or modern style of architecture. And then he strayed away from it and started to kind of develop this postmodern style, both, theoretically, but also, in terms of actual execution. So the main point of these two movements is that modern architecture is marked by technological advancements, a desire to create new forms of architecture, and they're characterized by functioning. That it's really about the function of the building. It's about the mass of the building, and what I mean by that is like how big can you go? How open can your spaces be? How many offices or floors can you fit in one structure? So it was about the function, and we talked about that a lot with the Carson Perry Scott building. That the actual store at the bottom level needed to be constructed in this really open format. It couldn't be structured so that there had to be, all these divisions of rooms and spaces on that main level when, you have to plan for a department store at that first level. So again, it was dictated a lot by function, minimalism, and just a rejection of, ornamentation and decoration. Where postmodern is kind of the opposite. They really want that complexity, that contradiction. They kind of relish in ornamentation, in decorative elements, in not so much just straight, clean lines, but more lines that have curvature to them, and also postmodern is all about looking towards the past and bringing in aspects of the past. Definitely revitalizing them and kind of reinventing them, but definitely referencing some of those kind of almost those qualities of the past that are memorable, and kind of bringing them back into a different type of appreciation. So what I went ahead and did, though, is I kind of broke it down into 3 styles. And the reason why I did this, these next 2 slides, is because I feel that this is huge for AP. I think that AP really wants you to walk away with these 3 terms and be able to understand them and apply them to the images that they have given us. So I think that that's really important. Remember, I told you that all of this is happening in the 20th century. So I think it's so confusing to call it 20th century architecture and postmodern architecture. It's all 20th century. So dividing it up into the three styles that occurred during this 20th century architecture, I think is more kind of what AP wants you to take away from it. So the first style is called the prairie style. And the characteristics for the prairie style of architecture is rejecting historic styles. So rejecting classical styles and styles from history. It a huge focus on the prairie style, hence the term, is that the structure should be in complete harmony with the site. And so a lot of that means that your structure should be constructed to the land that has been chosen for its site instead of vice versa. You really shouldn't have to manipulate the land in order for the structure to work. And then also visually and aesthetically, the architecture should just visually kind of flow and work well with the land. A huge technological advancement for prairie style is called this cantilever construction, which we will talk about, and then the use of organic materials. Organic materials being, stone, rock, concrete, wood, things like that. Then we have the international style. The international style is complete opposite. They are extremely clean, straight lines. Well, they're not extremely opposite. I'm sorry. I'm going to retract that. Really, the international style, I think, is just an extension of the prairie style. Stylistically, they have a lot of similar qualities. And that is why both of these styles are lumped into that 20th century architecture, okay, the modern architecture, because they are both modern styles. So they do have some similarities, but there are some extreme opposites. So the fact that they are looked at as more of like a machine, they're actually called machines for living. And so they have that kind of cold industrial look to them. They're completely minimalistic. They're completely about clean lines, usually zero ornamentation. And when I say ornamentation, I mean very rarely are they, even painted. They're usually just, blank white from the concrete. The concrete was one of the technological innovations, is that they use that skeleton system like we've learned about from the Carson Perry Scott building, but then they use this ferroconcrete, which are like these concrete slabs that then get affixed onto this skeleton structure. And so that's the innovation that occurs for the international style. And like I said before, there is zero ornamentation. And then we have that postmodern style. And again, it's the opposite. So it's a complete rejection of the international style. It fully embraces ornamentation, and it is all about being eclectic styles of the past. And eclectic means kind of piecing together, pulling from different areas and piecing it together to create one new style. So you might see a little bit of Greek influence in there, and you might see a little bit of Baroque in there, and you might see a hint of Romanesque, and all these things come together to create a new style that's called postmodern. Here, Grant gave us some examples of 20th century architecture or modern architecture. He gave us the Flatiron Building in New York, and then also the Gateway Arch. A lot of us wouldn't consider that architecture, but it is. And, it's both architecture and sculpture, I think. It's a very unique piece. But these are both examples of that modern architecture. And then he gave us some examples of some postmodern architecture. This is definitely like extreme postmodern architecture in the sense that it's kind of like postmodern meets contemporary. Um, there's these examples still stray away from tradition, and postmodern does indeed embrace tradition. But I think more importantly, what you can see here is things are really built around curves and roundedness, and that's definitely a rejection in the international style. But yet, postmodern, really embraces it. Okay, so just focusing on the images that belong to the modern architecture, we're going to start here with image 139. This is called Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright. This place is in Pennsylvania. It was constructed between 1936 and 39. And what we have here are reinforced concrete, sandstone, steel, and glass. Okay, there are 3 images with this, and he has included them in the next few slides. So contextually, what we're looking at here is a home that is about 90 minutes out of Pittsburgh. And this was a huge turning point in Wright's career. Many people think of Frank Lloyd Wright as the world's greatest architect. He definitely was one of, I think, the most innovative architects of the 20th century. He was really struggling. He, had an architectural business, was really struggling to keep it going. We're dealing with the early, 20th century, so we're dealing with post-war, we're dealing with depression, and it was a struggle to kind of keep his business going. And then he had developed an apprenticeship program that came to be known as the Fellowship. And this, really started to prosper, and it allowed Frank Lloyd Wright to become a mentor in the field of architecture, and he had quite a few followers that were part of this fellowship. And then a man named Edgar Kaufman Sr., he had asked Frank Lloyd Wright to design a few architectural pieces, one of them including Falling Water. And this was just a huge example of how Frank Lloyd Wright really wanted to merge nature with architecture. And so one of his biggest features and focuses was to, include and integrate the waterfall as part of the home. And so a cute little anecdote story here is that after speaking to Kaufman on the phone, Frank Lloyd Wright has sat down, drew up the whole design in about 2 hours, and basically went straight off of that design. Frank Lloyd Wright had such a desire for this organic architecture, and that was part of him being what is considered a transcendentalist. And to go even further, Frank Lloyd Wright was extremely inspired by Eastern philosophy and Eastern architecture. And so there is such a direct connection between Frank Lloyd Wright and Japanese architecture. And hopefully you're going to be able to notice some of those similarities for yourself. But that really was the core of his inspiration. Here's a great picture of the interior, and then a aerial kind of map perspective of the home. But in terms of form, it is very, very organic. It's an open and organic area and space. But Frank Lloyd Wright, just like Japanese architecture, is known for its being, extremely horizontal, that you have very prominent horizontal lines, and that it is more about those horizontal lines than it is about verticality. So hopefully you're seeing that relationship. It's also about there is a sense of irregularity and extreme complexity to his designs, but because he keeps the irregularity and the complexity always at this horizontal level, it still reads as a very simple design. Okay. You're going to see lots of rectangles, triangles, squares, and circles. So there is an organicness to it in the materials, but in terms of the actual space, there's a lot of kind of simple geometry. The cantilever construction is what is utilized quite a bit in the prairie style. And what that means, the cantilever construction, is when you have beams that jet out beyond the space to then create overhangs. Okay, so we're going to go back here 1 second. So these overhangs that jet out from, the facade of the home, these are like, balconies for this home. And they're, massive balconies. I mean, one of these balconies is probably as large as, my entire living room. And the way that they're able to jet out without having any support underneath it, so it looks like it's light as a feather, it looks like it's just totally floating, is because of cantilever construction. And so from the main house here, okay, they have beams that jet out and then allow construction to occur that looks like it's kind of free floating. This house and most of Frank Lloyd Wright's homes are made with organic qualities in the materials. So, you have concrete, but with, pebbles that are kind of sunken into it. You'll have stucco, you'll have natural woods, and then you'll have tons of just kind of earth tones. Nothing is going to be painted teal or, lime green. Everything's going to be your earth tones, your browns, your mustard colors, your, deeper like terracotta colors. And so again, that's the whole push into making architecture in harmony with nature. Here's another interior shot, and then another angle of all these kind of overhangs, which really shows great perspective for that cantilever construction. The living room too is just walls of glass. They call it the glass curtain. And what the concept of that is that you are seeing nothing but the nature that is surrounding you, and it really feels like there's nothing between you and the outdoors. That really also that the windows frame your the nature that's around you, and that becomes the artwork then that is on the walls. You can see that a lot of the walls and the floor is made from stone, but not just stone, but local. So that's another important aspect of prairie style, is that you use local materials. I mean, if you're trying to have your architecture in harmony with nature, you're going to definitely incorporate native materials, right? This, like I said, was a home that was built for Kaufman. I think it was more like his getaway home or his weekend home. But this is a perfect example of that prairie style. And Frank Lloyd Wright went on to construct tons and tons and tons of homes and buildings in this style. And he was a Chicago-based architect. So growing up, I was very lucky to be familiar and surrounded by his architecture. And there's even a tour that you could go on, a Frank Lloyd Wright architectural tour, that is just absolutely fascinating. Here is another wonderful image of the waterfall that extends out from the home, and a great kind of aerial perspective, or not aerial perspective, but a perspective that allows you to look up to those balconies, and you can really see the grandness of that cantilever construction. I mean, they really just look like they're light as a feather and floating above. Grant had compared this to the Monticello home of Thomas Jefferson, and I think that was a great comparison because even though stylistically they're completely different, you have one that is completely classical and one that is modern, but they were both committed to using those local materials. So I thought that that was a really great connection. Okay, so moving on, we covered that prairie style. Now we're going to look at international style. Remember, we're still talking about modern architecture or 20th century architecture, but we're looking at different styles, okay? So for our international style, this is image 135. It's called the Villa Savoye, and it's by Lee Corbusier. And it's from 1929. It is made of steel and that reinforced concrete. So contextually, we have Corbusier considered the nature of modern life and architecture's role in the new machine age. And so this was an architect or a group of architects who really believed that, modern life should kind of look almost industrial. Now, I'm hoping that maybe you remembered something from our last screencast. Our last screencast was about constructivism and the distill movement. Hoping something is connecting for you, something is sparking. Because when we talked about that distill movement, we talked about how it really flourished within architecture. But I said I was going to save it. Well, here it is. The distill movement really pushed its style in the field of architecture. And I am hoping that just by looking at this image, you can easily see the connection. Even though this is three-dimensional, even though it's, black and white, the quality of how it really compares to like Pierre Mondrian's painting of composition of, red, blue, and yellow, where it's just made up of straight lines and squares and rectangles. And what do we have here in a three-dimensional sense? We have straight lines, squares, and rectangles, and we have black and white. And so to me, this looks like a three-dimensional painting of Pierre Mondrian. So I'm really hoping that you are, being able to see that connection because they're so important that you're able to see how one movement kind of bleeds and feeds into another movement, okay? So back to Corbusier, he stated the house should be a machine for living in, and it is perfectly realized within the forms, the layouts, the materials, and sitting in the Villa Savoye. So, what he felt was that it's not that it shouldn't be a personal experience, but it should really emulate this modern society, this modern movement, which was really about, industry and the machine age and kind of that futurist perspective. And he felt that your home should work for you, right? It should be that machine that you live in. And so that was kind of his philosophy, and he wanted the aesthetics definitely to match that. But remember that international style was also about the way it was constructed, which we'll get more into. It's located just outside Paris. It's located on a large, unrestricted site that allowed him to have complete, total creative freedom. He had been working and developing on these theories for such a long time about modern architecture and throughout the previous decade. And if you look at the timing here, 1929, okay, we're really close to, the distill movement and that what was happening in with that movement as well. And remember, it started, in the kind of the Netherlands, and kind of nestled within that Eastern European area, but definitely spread, and especially flourished in architecture. Okay. Um, so a lot of this information is really about Corbusier, and how he was kind of this leader and this proponent of modern architecture, and publishing essays on it. And he would just really was really focused on this concept of modern times, and it went beyond architecture. I mean, it flourished in the ideas of cars, airplanes, factories. He just really marveled at the beauty of their construction, their efficiency, their output, the way that that to him was kind of the foundation of innovation, and that was what was really exciting to him. Um, by 1926, he devised 5 points of architecture, which he viewed as a universal system that could be applied to any architectural site. I'm hoping that that last comment sparked another connection for you um, between the international style and the digital movement. Because remember, when we talked about the digital movement and we talked about the artists of that movement, their goal was the same as Corbusier, where it was about this universal language that they, didn't want any sort of fluff, nothing to do with symbolism or interpretation or an ode to the past, or, expression. That it was really about being a modern society and coming together and creating this just very simple universal language. So he really, was embracing those same theories and concepts as well. In terms of form, we have very clean, spacious white lines on the facade. The internal structure is a skeleton system, so that's very, very important. That international style is known for that, which again, we got that, we learned about that from the Carson Perry Scott building. And then that is the structure of support, right? The skeleton system. And then once you have that skeleton framework, then you kind of cover it with, your facade. And the international style would use that ferro concrete and glass. So basically, concrete and glass that would be put up around this, skeleton structure of steel, steel beams and steel rods, and then you would attach your walls and your surfaces to that. Okay. You have complete lack of architectural ornamentation or avoidance of sculpture or paint or anything at all. You have an open floor plan. You do have natural lighting, very simplistic, white, box-like. Again, it still embraces that horizontal quality, which is a great kind of characteristic of modern architecture. And really what you have is an abstraction of a house. We talked about the distill movement being extremely abstract, to the point where I would say non-objective. You're bringing art down to its most simple forms. And for distill, it was just narrowing it down to like 4 elements of art, period. And it's the same thing here with the architecture. You're bringing it down to its most simplest form, where you have walls and a roof and windows, and it's kind of like, what more do you need, right? So in terms of content, what we're looking at here, this villa is a 3-bedroom villa. It does have some servants' quarters. At the bottom is a circle, but that's actually like the garage or the carport. so that you can drive right in and then enter the house directly from the carport. Then you have kind of this patio that goes around the carport. So up here is all the like living quarters. And then up here you have kind of like rooftop, patios and decks and stuff. You have a very open interior, free from walls. And again, we're able to have that because of skeleton construction. And referencing again, Carson Perry Scott Building, they needed to do the same thing to create a department store. I know for a fact, because I have seen it in an AP test, but this style of windows where it's very horizontal and covers the length from left to right, but it's horizontal, right? It's not tall and vertical. This is called a ribbon style of windows, and so that's an important thing to remember. We do have a spiral staircase because, really we have a few centering circles, okay, that is surrounded by complete squares and rectangles. So again, simple geometry, simple shapes. It looks like a delicate floating box that he designed as both a functional house and a type of modernist sculpture. It's a beautiful blend of form and function, which again, we talked about that with the Distill movement, this universal design of just this perfect balance between form and function. It offered an escape from the crowded city of Paris. And the patrons for this villa was Pierre and Emily Savoye. And this was their, country home, their weekend home, their getaway home. In terms of innovations, you have this streamlined look of complexity. It's a careful consideration to some of the classical ideas, but just everything is completely simplified. I thought that it was a great comparison to the house of Veti in Pompeii because you have that atrium style, and we kind of have something similar to the house of Savoye, and also just the use of these columns and how they break up space. And I think that that's also very apparent here in the villa. Okay, so keeping with the international style, okay, so we've gone over prairie style, and then we have two images for that international style. We have image number 146, the Seagram Building. This is by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson. This is in New York City. It's from 1954 to 1958. So we're going to step away from kind of personal homes and look at a skyscraper. And what we have here is steel frame with glass curtain wall and the use of bronze. So a lot of similarities to that Carson Perry Scott building, but definitely with more of a modern kind of approach. Remember that Carson Perry Scott building had a lot of that Art Nouveau influence in it. So this is a much more modern approach. So we have that steel frame, again, that skeleton frame with the glass curtains, the glass curtain wall and bronze. Okay, the bronze is really what is kind of giving it its uniqueness because it gives it that nice kind of brownish tone. It's set back from the street and here has a wide plaza that is balanced by a lot of reflecting pools. That bronze veneer gives the building just this monolithic look. It's what makes it very unique. It's a reflective quality. It's a metallic quality. And this model of skyscraper really became the main model after World War II. So this was quite an influential method of construction and look for quite some time. It's an office building, and it was purposeful that the structural elements be visible. Okay, that was part of the aesthetic, was that you are able to clearly see the materials that are being utilized. It is definitely the mindset of modern architecture that less is more. Okay, so you can look at this and you can see in its simplicity that, this is extremely modern. It's clean. It's just like a repetition of a very predictable pattern, and that's it. There's no extra ornamentation. There's no detail. It's just this interplay of vertical and horizontal lines. Again, if you think of distill, we have lines, we have squares, we have rectangles, and that's it. And that's just a huge push for this movement. Again, it's international style of architecture. And this is located in Midtown Manhattan. Here it is at night with some of the windows lit up. It's definitely a symbol of capitalism and economic power. The materials were very expensive, a lot because of that bronze veneer. And Grant had compared it to the Acropolis, which I think is interesting because as Athens was the center of the world in 400 BC, New York was kind of the center of the world at this time. And again, they were both, structures of power. And that's exactly a, really great comparison with past and present. Okay, so now we're getting into that last style and our last image for postmodern architecture. And that brings us to image 152. This is titled The House in Newcastle County. It's by Robert Venturi. It was kind of a collaboration with headed by Robert Venturi, but John Broush and Denise Scott Brown. It is located in Delaware. This was constructed in between 78 and 83. So we talked about that time period for postmodernism, really flourished in the 80s. We have wood frame and stucco. And remember, again, categorizing these three styles. We saw the Prairie style. We saw two images for international style. And now we're looking at an image for postmodern. Okay. Hopefully, off the bat, you're seeing some major differences. So in terms of context, this is in northern Delaware. Venturi had studied architecture at Princeton University. He attended the American Academy in Rome during the mid-1950s. And he definitely developed he was very partial towards Renaissance architecture, especially during Mannerist and Baroque periods in Italy. He published a book called Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. But rather than copy a specific style, what he would do is, like I said before, be eclectic. He would borrow freely from multiple, styles of history, and then kind of collage them and juxtapose them together to reinvent a new style. Now, I'm reminding you though that he did design and construct some architecture in that international style, in that modern style, but it wasn't satisfying to him. It was not pleasing to him. He felt that it was very cold and definitely was not something that society needed. And so he really kind of went on this quest for going against that and rejecting that and coming up with something new and different. So he really is kind of the the frontier man and the founder of this postmodern architecture movement. So in terms of content, it is a house that was designed for a family of three, surrounded by rolling hills and a forest. The wife there was a musician, so the house has a very elaborate, beautiful music room. The husband was a bird watcher, so that's why you're going to see very large, tall windows that look out into that kind of tree forest area. And then the rear facade is very flat and classical and has these kind of cartoon-like columns. I mean, you can see the influence of the columns, but yet they've been reinvented, and that's what gives it that postmodern edge. Okay, in terms of form, the front facade of the house incorporates a floating arched screen. So this is important. I know that if AP is going to ask you some questions about this image, they're going to ask you this. And so it's important to know that this is called a floating arch. And it's like a highway billboard. It rises kind of awkwardly from the lower edge of the gable. Remember, the gable is like the overhang, okay? And it just kind of is this, screen that sits on top of that. Venturi claimed that this curved feature had this like Austrian Baroque kind of origin to it, like inspired by a garden gate, or dormers that were found on some of the Victorian houses. But it functions more like a symbol, is what I would say, that identifies the structure as a residence. So now we're getting into architecture that not only kind of are odes to the past, but there's symbolism involved, and there's personalization, which is total opposite of what was happening with the international style and even the prairie style, because the prairie style it was still a modern movement, but it was so focused on bringing architecture together with its environment, bringing it together with nature, that it didn't really matter too much about the personality of the owner or the patron. It was more about how it interacted with its surroundings, okay? International style had nothing personalized about it at all, but now we're like over personalizing and making each decision based off of the patrons of the home, their needs, the aspects of history, and the symbols of what the home stands for. The innovation is that it is postmodern architecture and all of the things that come along with it. The facades, again, functioning as a sign, that's definitely innovative. And it's this pluralistic view of architecture and design. And again, looking towards the past and reinventing those inspirations and those qualities to make a new style. And Grant had compared it to the Gesù facade in Rome. He felt that both architects put a heavy emphasis on the facade. And I think that is, again, he's really nailed these comparisons. Because if you remember, this facade of this structure in Gesù is not at all what the actual structure is, right? The front part, the ceiling doesn't even go that high. This is just kind of, it's not really what the actual interior, it doesn't mimic the actual interior. It's just kind of like your first impression, and then whatever's behind the door is whatever's behind the door. And so I think that that's just a spot on comparison. I really enjoyed that. So here's some of that vocabulary and some summary of points between the two. and those are his sources. And so thank you so much. I hope that you were able to make some really strong connections between this presentation and the distill movement. I hope that you were able to understand the differences between these three styles of architecture, and hopefully you really got a lot out of this presentation.